The topic today is architecture in Agile. So this is a good topic. We have covered this one time before, and still comes up in most of the teams who are practicing Agile. And the challenge in this topic is every team struggles with the fact how much software architecture and design need to do upfront versus do it along the way. And the related questions, so what happens to the role of classical software architect? Does the role evolve or change? So we'll cover these two related topics and address this in today's webinar. The session is going to be roughly around 45 minutes. We'll take some questions along the way as usual. Many of you have been with our webinars, so you know the general format. But we'll reserve some time at the end also for taking some questions which are better suitable, better fit to be taken at the end. And then we'll make the document as well as the recording available in a day or two after the webinar. With that, let me introduce our presenter today is Michael Hall. He is the CEO and founder of 3 Beacons. And Michael has been a regular presenter in this webinar series. He is a real hands-on software practitioner and has been practicing Agile methods for over a decade now. He is a certified Scrum Master and has performed Scrum Master and Product Owner roles on a number of projects leading teams to successful outcomes. So he really deals with this topic day in, day out. So I'm glad to have Michael with us to cover this topic. With that, over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you. Well, I think before we get started, I will thank Hemant for the opportunity, and especially usually when Hemant introduces me, he uses a term called seasoned.
Yeah,
and I guess I have trained him to stop using that, because if you're as old as I am, you really know what that word really means. So. Okay, folks, let's jump into it. Well, welcome to today's seminar. As Hemant described, the topic is architecture in Agile. And I hope to share with you how architecture works in an Agile environment and give you some insights into the Agile Architect role. With that, let's jump into it. Now, there are many definitions of architecture. Here is one from the Rational Unified Process. Some of you, many of you may be familiar with the RUP process. Most definitions of architecture talk about, the software organization, the interfaces, the structural elements, the composition, the frameworks, even the style that goes into the organization. But architecture is also concerned with things such as usage, functionality, performance, resilience, and etc. It's a very broad, far-reaching endeavor and very important to project success. So if that's a definition of architecture, well, what is an architect? Once again, many definitions, but most include things such as the person that makes some major decisions about the hardware and software, the person who points out the established design patterns to follow, the person who figures out if there is some reuse available, and also quality attributes and trade-offs. So that's a quick definition of architecture and architects, just to kind of cue it up. Well, let's look at some differences of architecture between traditional, which by that word I mean waterfall or any variant of waterfall, versus Agile. Now on this slide, I'm not really sure if the diagram is a fair depiction with an architect sitting in an ivory tower and dictating, and the developers doing the low-level work. But in my experience, there definitely is a gap between the two in a traditional environment. In traditional architecture, it's very focused around documents and, what is the deliverable form for your architecture effort. If the focus is on document creation, you may want to rethink that approach, and especially after this seminar, hopefully I'll give you some hints and advice into how to rethink that role. Traditional architecture is all about big design up front or big architecture up front, and then once that architecture is documented, the issue becomes enforcement of that architecture rather than active engagement with the development teams. Now, I know this is a little bit extreme, and if you're currently working in a traditional environment, hopefully you are not experiencing any of this, but at least from my experience perspective, oftentimes this is how it feels and works within a traditional architecture environment. Now, if I have some clients who have a traditional architecture approach, but yet their development teams are Scrum and their team is Agile. So when this happens, basically the architecture team does all the upfront thinking, captures that in a document, throws it over this wall. I like to call it the wall of uncertainty. And then the Scrum team gets it, and they try their best to adhere to it within their 2 to 4 week iterations. But the thing that I'm trying to point out here is traditional architecture just does not mesh well into the iterative and highly collaborative world of Agile and Scrum teams. Scrum teams are used to adapting based on their learnings each and every sprint. So without a willingness to let the architecture evolve, Scrum teams will feel constrained by the traditional architecture. In comparison, Agile architecture or architecture in Agile is quite different. You know, you start with just enough to get going. I like to use this mantra that says, start with what you know, clarify as you go. And so a lot of it is about offering up alternatives to the architecture, you know, without making a definitive statement that it should be or must be this specific architecture. Offer up 2 or 3 alternatives and say, you know, I'm not sure, but as we go through these sprints and do our iterative development, hopefully one of these approaches will emerge. And oftentimes what emerges is a mesh of all of those alternatives, and the product wins. So a key point here is that decisions are a result of development, not so much someone's previous experiences or speculation. The architecture in Agile is emergent. It evolves over time as we learn more and more about the system. It's also incremental. We build on it as we do our iterations. And again, Agile architecture would also provide guidance to the development team. Okay, so again, not so much enforcement, but listening, learning, and reacting. Architecture in Agile is definitely continuous. If you look at the diagram, the arrow pointing to the users, you know, the architecture or the architect is talking to the users to fully understand their requirements. Looking at the arrow pointing to the product owner and team, there are architecture stories put in the product backlog, and ideally prioritized high enough to get some early learnings and consideration of the different alternatives. Also, any unresolved architecture issues, they should be tracked on the backlog. Also, looking at the arrow that points to the product backlog, again, the product backlog is an evolutionary type artifact in Scrum, and therefore the architecture stories within that would evolve. And finally, the arrow pointing to the product increment. The architects in an Agile world are involved in guiding the implementation. There's actually hands-on development of prototypes and development of some of the crucial frameworks, you know, some of the structural software elements that help grease the path of success for the team. So this may be a big difference between traditional architecture and architecture in Agile, is that the primary deliverable for the Agile architect is code, just like the developers on the Scrum team.
Let's take one question, which is somewhat different but related to the pages you're presenting right now.
Okay.
Which is, how do you address achieving technical feasibility for capitalization. So usually what happens in R&D, you can capitalize some parts. I think this question relates to that topic. I don't know if
yes, I am familiar. You know, a lot of product development is able to be capitalized, because if you're working towards a product and that product is going to be long-lived, then capitalization rules kick in and you can depreciate that effort over a certain number of years. And then anything that is more research-oriented or investigatory or training would really be on the expense side. So I would say architecture, especially if it is within an Agile team, the architect is helping build the product. Therefore, their label, their outputs should all be able to be capitalized. I don't know if that was exactly the question, but
yeah, I don't know either. But let's keep going and let's take another question. And I'm sure we have more questions that we'll pick up. The question is this: the content you're covering related to architecture is applicable to all flavors, meaning Scrum, XP, and is asking TBD, which is different, but there's architecture common for all these.
Yes, yes, I think regardless of which Agile method you are using, whether it's Scrum, Extreme Programming, Lean, or really most Agile teams pick and choose and build their own ecosystem of what of these pieces to move forward with from their development ecosystem and culture. Regardless of that, you know, emergent design and emergent architecture are critical components in that. So yes, I would say that this is not just for Scrum teams. It's for any Agile team.
Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Thanks.
Okay. Good. Good questions, folks. Keep them coming. Well, the artifacts for an Agile architecture approach. Well, lots of vision presentations, lots of diagrams, lots of whiteboarding sessions, lots of models, not so much a huge thorough document. Maybe there's a small overview document which is more overview in nature, but mostly it's about diagrams and communication and collaboration. Now, how does architecture in Agile scale? This is Dean Leffingwell's capture of how Agile scales in his excellent book called Agile Software Requirements. And you'll see at the very highest level there, the portfolio level, you can see that there's an architectural runway, and it has these architectural epics that are, you know, big, broad activities that basically say we'd like to re-architect our system to better support fill in the blank. And then the point that the architecture evolves continuously. And then at the program level, these architectural epics flow down to the program level, and they're split into architectural features by the architects and even to some extent the system team at the program level. And those architectural features are shown in a release, just like regular business value features. And then the architectural features flow down to the team level, which is the lowest level there. And as they flow down, the architectural features are split into architectural stories by the development teams. And then those architectural stories are prioritized into the team backlogs, and when the time is right, the development on those occurs. And yes, the architects would be helping and involved in the development of those architectural type stories. So this architecture efforts flow very much in the same way as products do, from the portfolio level down to the features, down to the user stories. So, you know, when you think about scaling Agile, you know, fitting architecture in there certainly works also. In a nutshell, Agile architecture. Well, let's look at the lower part here, the defining the initial architecture. At this level, initially, it's very high level, and as I said before, it presents several alternatives. And then as you get up into the implementation sprints, the architecture is discussed and reviewed within the sprints. And as the coding occurs, more and more learnings about that architecture are found, and the team starts leaning towards one architecture or the other, or as I said before, a mesh of the good points of all of the alternatives. And then it is continuous at the very top. Architecture is refined as the learnings emerge based on developer feedback.
It might help if you can clarify in the previous page what exactly is the architectural runway, the one before that.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Yeah, this is this is at the portfolio level. So think about your system. You know, at the portfolio level, you're going to say, okay, at some point in the future, I would like for our product to support voice-activated commands. I'm just making something up. So that's an example of a portfolio epic, which is going to have several features, which each of those features are going to have multiple user stories. So architectural runway are the grander things. You know, I wish this is where we would define things to move our architecture over. I'm just making something up here. Maybe we're Linux-based right now, and we really need to be .NET. So you have an architectural epic describing that. And of course, the bigger the epic, the longer the runway, because it's going to involve more. Another one might be some structural change in the software that would help reduce maintenance costs. And allocating the time to get that in there so that you know, the product as it's being built, you can accomplish some of these architecture objectives as you go. You know, nobody's ever going to stop production of a product, take 4 months off and do some architectural updates or changes. That rarely happens. You have to do it as you go. So this is Leffingwell's attempt, which I think is actually quite good, of how to account for those architectural efforts that are not necessarily business value related. Good. Okay. Dean Leffingwell also spells out, actually I think it's 8 principles now, but I'll just point out a few of these, the 7 that I have here from an architecture and agile perspective. Principle number 1, the team that codes the system designs the system. So the development teams are responsible for the design and the architecture. And that's why it's good that your Agile Architect is part of the Scrum team. Principle number 3, when in doubt, code it out. It's always better to make a decision based on what your code is telling you as opposed to speculation or guessing. And then principle number 7, there is no monopoly on innovation. You know, architects are brilliant people, no doubt. However, innovation can come from anyone and everyone on the team. So making sure everybody understands that evolving towards the best architecture for the system is part of their responsibility also is a good thing. And in doing so, they're going to be expected to innovate. Okay, let's talk about the Agile Architect role. Well, I've tried my best to summarize it in terms of 4 sub-roles. The Agile Architect is a service provider. They are also an alternatives creator. We've talked a little bit about that. They're also a technical coach, and they're also a linchpin. Now, on the service provider front, the Agile Architect is responsible for obviously addressing the requirements, but they do that by working directly with the developers instead of so much writing documents. And the Agile architects, as I've said before, actually develop any required frameworks, or as many of those as they can, and prototypes, and then actually demo those to the Scrum team and get developer feedback on that. And then also training the Scrum team on how to use those frameworks. And doing all of this really builds the trust. Service provider, you have to play the middle ground if you're an Agile architect. I'd like to step through at least 3 of these, because there's a sweet spot of guidance between guiding too weakly and guiding excessively. So let's look at a few. Let's go to the second one, communication. If the architect is guiding too weakly, the communication is all about asking the clients for ideas and concepts. Now let's bounce over to the right column. If the architect is guiding excessively, it's all about they create concepts in solitude and publish them for their minions to follow. Now, if you're in the sweet spot, though, what you're doing is you're driving concepts in close communication loops, and that's why it's important to be part of the Scrum team. You have a daily feedback loop with a daily stand-up. You have an iteration or sprint feedback loop at the sprint review. And the retrospective. And obviously, you have release feedback. And as we all know, in Agile, feedback is constant or continuous. Let's look at the next one, learning. If your architect is guiding too weakly, they tend to change their mind on the basis of each instance of feedback. And that's a formula for disaster. I've seen it quite a bit, that the architecture reflects whoever the architect talked to lastly, and now if the architect is guiding excessively, then they're absolutely ignoring feedback. So the sweet spot is that the Agile architect turns feedback into improvements and evolves the architecture as they go. Let's look at one last one, practical support. If the architect is guiding too weakly, then the architect works as just as a developer. I say just as, it's not meant to be a demeaning comment. It's very important work. The architect guiding excessively does no coding and avoids developer contact. The architect hitting the sweet spot supports the developers by hands-on coding, and that's where the trust factor comes in.
Mike, let's take one clarification question. On one of your pages was, and the previous page was, what does the fact that system architecture is a role collab mean? In the page 14, sounds like you said something about role collab. Yeah. Okay. Maybe the next page. It's something about role collaboration, which was not clear. I don't see it. So I think the person who's asking.
Yeah, I don't see it on any bullets. May have misspoken about that. So maybe if the issuer of that question could maybe rewrite it.
Okay, right. Yeah. So let's keep going.
I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay. So on slide 14, there's a clarification.
Okay. Here we go.
So
on slide 14.
So okay. See.
Yeah. Okay. So the Agile architect plays multiple roles. I believe that this is what the person is asking for. And in my opinion, those multiple roles can be described in these 4 categories. The Agile architect must be a service provider. They must also create.
It is on the previous page.
13 is a.
Okay, fine.
Technical coach and also linchpin. So again, if you can reword the question, I'll be glad to try my best to answer it.
Okay. And the 14, another separate question is, can you elaborate on the bullet point, don't worry about breaking the rules, worry about system quality?
Yeah, that's in a traditional world, the traditional architect defines the architecture, and then as I said before, it's about enforcement. And only the architect can break the rules, right? So in an Agile world, oftentimes through development, you will find that some of the original rules thought up as far as the architecture goes are no longer valid. So it is okay to break those rules and not feel bad about it, but the architect should lead in that respect in terms of saying, okay, this rule is no longer valid, it's broken, but maybe here's another approach that we're heading off to. So it's really important for the Agile architect to feel comfortable with breaking the rules, but then advising the development team on how to break the rules. Okay, that's good. Okay, very good questions. Let's keep going. Alternatives creator. Well, a single architectural approach will feel dictated. So the Agile architect gives the development team guidance on the pros and cons of each alternative, and most importantly, hints on what would constitute a decision towards one or another. So, for example, if the Agile architect offers up 3 different alternatives, he or she should state, look, if you see this, then the ultimate architecture is probably evolving over to what I'm presenting as number 1. If you see that, it's probably evolving over to what I'm presenting as number 2. So giving the developers hints on what would constitute a movement towards one or the other is also very important. And again, like I've said before, more often than not, a mesh of all the great ideas from the alternatives will emerge as the best overall architecture. Technical coach, a very important aspect of the Agile Architect role. And this involves giving suggestions and guidance to the developers during the sprints, and then obviously lobbying the product owner to prioritize the architecturally significant stories very high in the backlog so that those learnings can occur quickly in the project, and even go so far as reviewing the sprint deliverables to ensure that there is some level of architectural integrity, and the architect may learn something about the implementation of an architecture that they did not realize previously. Linchpin. As an Agile architect, you are the linchpin. You're the glue that brings it all together, the Agile and the architecture. And it's very similar to a Sherpa guiding the team up to the mountaintop summit, and plus, in my opinion, the ultimate architecture is a responsibility of everybody on the team, including the person that plays the Agile architect role. But one way to think about it is that the Agile architect, through their actions, helps guide and ensures that the best architecture emerges on a system that's shipped. Well, Nokia Siemens did a survey, I guess it was about 4 years ago, of over 2,400 software-related employees, and they found that 70% of all architects are satisfied or very satisfied with the impact of Agile development on their work. So if you are currently in a traditional environment, this is more proof that migrating to an Agile environment will not necessarily cause your architects to go crazy. We have evidence today that they will actually appreciate that change. And the reason is because Agile has continuous feedback, so you have these improved feedback cycles, and it's a new role closer to actual development. And again, Hemant and I were talking prior to the webinar about the typical career development move for a very talented software engineer is over to an architect. And I was explaining to him that while that's very good for the person and they get a much-deserved promotion, now all of their thought is going into visualizing architecture and writing a document if you're in a traditional world, and no longer so much coding. Chances are they were one of the most talented coders on the team. And that's what's really good about Agile architecture, or architecture in Agile, is that the architects participate with the development team, and they code. They may code different pieces. Mostly what they're coding are structural or framework or prototypes. Okay. At this point, we've looked at Agile architecture versus traditional architecture, and also the role of the Agile architect. Now let's look a little closer at this concept of emergent architecture. Now we all know in Agile, design is emergent, and in very much the same way, architecture in Agile is emergent. If you look on the left side here, a more traditional approach would be to put a lot of time and effort in to defining the architecture up front, and then you're focusing a large amount of work to define everything up front in the hopes of limiting the rework efforts. And it's a very anticipatory type approach. In Agile, which is the right side of this letter or fulcrum, Agile takes a different approach. There is some upfront architectural thinking that's done. As I said, it's just enough to get going. It's somewhat high level and is mostly about potential alternatives, and then helping the teams uncover their learnings, which would guide towards one of those or a mesh. And then remember, the real architecture will emerge from the development. So you see a smaller, I guess, area for the upfront architecture, and then some rework, a lot of evaluation, a lot of assessment, and a lot of adjusting. Now, you may be saying at this point, well, the adjustment and rework along the way is too costly, but we now have data that clearly shows the entire combination of this approach has proven over the last 10 to 12 years to be much less costly than traditional approach and better. I think in the traditional approach, we convince ourselves that we are good enough to anticipate everything up front, or most everything up front, and the reality is that we're not good enough to do that, and we are, I guess, ignoring something very important. We're ignoring that there will be learnings within the iterative development that may morph our architecture. And a great quote by Neil Ford. I won't read it to you, but I just love this quote. We'll talk about the last phrase. You don't yet know what you don't know. And this is the key. How do you know what you did not know before? So one answer to that is get to coding as soon as possible. Learn from that and adapt. And then you'll know what you didn't know before. So here's a quick review of the Agile architecture technique. Up front, identify potential alternatives. Lots of knowledge share. Discuss it with the development team. It's all about diagrams and then the hands-on coding of the frameworks and prototypes. Identification of those architecturally significant stories. Get them prioritized high in the backlog. Make friends with the product owners so that happens. And then participate in the iterative development. And the architect is there to help guide the decisions that the development team is making, and is actually part of the development team, and adjust that architecture as you go.
let's take one question here. The upfront part that you were saying, which is knowledge sharing and identifying potential alternatives and so on, is that happening in what some teams call iteration zero, or how does, or where is this actually happening?
Yeah, there's a common term called sprint zero, which is, it's intended to do some planning, do some upfront architecture and design work, to help ensure that sprint one is more successful. So, yes, I would say, sprint zero is, if your team uses that concept, it's kind of a bucket or placeholder for some upfront discussions. But you may be working a project or software system that's simple enough, you really don't even need a full 2 weeks to move the yardstick forward on the architecture and design well enough that the team feels confident to get going into pure coding. So, but yes, generally that would be done in sprint zero. And again, as the architecture stories are identified, you want to try to get those out by, prioritized high enough to get them developed and the learnings within the first 3 or 4 sprints. Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. Okay, let's look at a quick case study here. It's described in Scott Bain's book on emergent design. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, I would highly advise it. Now, I've taken some liberties. I've kind of showing it as an architectural evolution. I believe in the book it's more about design evolution, but taking a step back, I think you can also see that it's architecture evolution also. So here was the problem. There was a number of, there was a hospital that was spread across multiple buildings, and they needed a means of communication for doctors and nurses to pull up patient records regardless of which building, regardless of which one of the 5 buildings that they happen to be in. So what they came up with is this, this microwave transceiver, and on the top of each of the buildings, and that would communicate these electronic records to and from the doctors and nurses. Now, each of these transceivers is made up of a collection of chips, VLSI chips, and the requirement for this system was continuous uptime because doctors and nurses work 24/7 around the clock. And so the direction to the project team was to create a monitoring capability to constantly query and verify the health of the VLSI chip components. And when one of those went out or started reporting trouble, then they could send a technician to replace it, and communication would continue unadulterated. So this is the initial architecture option that was discussed. And as you can see, it has 3 tiers. The leftmost tier is a hardware tier, the middle tier, and then the rightmost tier is client tier. So at the hardware tier, this is where the actual hardware would be, the drivers, the boot support packages that are needed to run the transceivers, and then providing an outward-facing interface view to the rest of the system. In the middle tier, this is where the original architecture had this piece called the component manager that would read an ASCII file in, which would contain the definitions of the transceivers and the different VLSI chips that made up that transceiver. And then the component manager would actually create different versions of the objects associated for the VLSI components, and they in turn would query the drivers and actually pull status from the actual hardware. On the client tier, you can have client workstations that can poll for status on a particular transceiver or VLSI, and then there's a concept of a status monitor, and which provides a comprehensive status view. If you're familiar with network management systems, that would be akin to a status monitor. So this was the initial architectural option that was discussed. Now, what the team found as they got into Sprint 2, they realized that there was an additional requirement for support of what's called complex machines. So a transceiver is not just a collection of VLSI chips. Oh, wouldn't our world be so much better if it was that simple? The transceiver can actually have boards, and the boards can have subboards, and each board and the subboard can have VLSI chips. So their architecture evolved, especially in the middle tier, to account for boards, subboards, and the VLSI chips. And they determined that the ASCII file, which had the definition of this relationship, was no longer adequate. They switched over to an XML file because it's easier to show more complex relationships in that. So you'll see in the middle tier there a fairly significant architectural change. In Sprint 4, the team also uncovered a finding that different encryption mechanisms would be needed depending on the boards that were used. So they had to introduce this shaded blue component called encryption, and then before reporting that out to a status monitor, the different encryption types were executed on that. So again, this is and again, I've tried to pull this up from a 30,000-foot view. It's an example of how architecture can evolve during development based on coding and learning. And this is where they got to in Sprint 4, and I think if you compare it with the original alternative, it's actually quite different. Okay, let's wrap up here with a view of a fully integrated approach to Agile architecture. Okay, so in the middle here is the classic Scrum diagram. So the architectural approach for integrating here would be to, as I've said before, start with some initial architectural options and review those with the development team and also with the business side. So it's always good to make sure that your business side is engaged in the potential alternatives there. Then, as development progresses, help identify the product backlog items that really need to be done for the early sprints, within the early sprints, and offer those up to the product owner and ensure that those get in the product backlog. As development continues, it's all about, if I'm an Agile architect, I'm going to pitch in with the development team, and I'm going to be developing prototypes, and I'm going to be showing those to the developers, taking their feedback, handing those off. Maybe somebody can transition that prototype into live working system software. And it's also about development of the structural frameworks, and then as diagrams and small documents are needed to capture key learnings, then participate and provide that. As the development ensues, the Agile Architect is giving technical guidance to the development team. They're monitoring team progress. They're part of the Scrum team, so they are responsible for the performance, just like everybody on the team is, as to whether or not that commitment is met. And they take more of a servant leader type approach, and they serve the team. And a good question to ask at this point is, what else can I do to help our team continue progressing or de-risk a certain area or position ourselves better for the next sprint? Continue to evolve the architecture based on coding. As the architect, you should verify that the architecture helps to meet the requirements and communicate the current architecture to the business side so that everybody is aware. Always providing feedback and listening to feedback from the developers, and breaking the rules in the right way as we discussed previously. And then, it's okay, last responsible moment decisions. This is a lean concept, saying it's okay that we don't know, we don't have that decision right now. Let's continue learning and we'll defer that decision and make it at a more appropriate time. Otherwise, we might get boxed into a particular solution architecture. And then, as an Agile architect, just like the team does, feel very passionate and accept ownership of the final architecture. So that's kind of a fully integrated Agile architecture approach. If you take one thing out of this seminar today, that would be slide 30, and kind of compare that with your current situation in your business, and maybe pass that on to someone and say, hey, can we start doing this? Conclusion. Well, Agile and architecture are not at odds. The architects are part of the Scrum team. They code. You'll see the picture there. The Agile Architect is actually an integral member of the green team, and he's frantically searching for the rugby ball because he wants to start lateraling it and getting in a position to score. Agile methods can really help ensure that an optimal architecture is achieved. So I would wholeheartedly ask you to embrace them. And then if you have any concerns about a loss of power, ivory tower type thinking, that is more than offset by the trust gained while supporting and guiding the developers. Again, I would refer you back to the Nokia Siemens study that showed 70% were pleased or very pleased with the impact that Agile had on their job. And a great quote by Jim Coplian, architecture is not living in a document. It is living in code. And that sentence could actually stop right there. But he goes on and says, well, otherwise it would be a beautiful piece of fiction. So stay out of the fiction world and stay in the real world. A couple of references. These white papers were just tremendous help to me to come up with this summarized material. So if you start with any of these, I would recommend the 5 white papers listed there. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Hemant.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. So we have, as usual, a few questions, and I'll encourage audience to keep putting in more questions as they come to you. And while you're doing that, I'll just take a couple minutes and introduce Synergip. We organize these webinars once a month. And as your page refreshes, I'll go through a quick introduction to Synergip in a nutshell, and then we'll start taking the questions. So Synergip is a software development services firm. We do product development work for our clients who are typically small to mid-sized software companies. They tend to be venture-backed software companies, and we help them with ongoing software development work for the entire software development lifecycle following Agile techniques. For every client, we put together a dedicated team of high-caliber software professionals, which is important. We really believe that a team approach to software development is the right approach, and keeping the team stable and dedicated is the right way to build quality software. And we are able to work with the clients in a very effective way by balancing the risk and development agility by following Agile techniques. So and we've been big proponents of Agile and continue to sharpen our own saw following Agile techniques along the way. But for every client, we tailor the degree and the specific Agile practices that are relevant to be used for that client. And then we are able to also offer significant cost advantage. We have a dual shore team, a team in India and on the US side. That combined team, we are able to provide the front end experience to the clients in this US time zone and in this locale, and yet provide the cost advantage and the talent availability of a team sitting in India. The last point is the flexibility that we provide to our clients. Many of our clients start with us, and then they want to have the long-term flexibility that when they do an IPO or when they get acquired or when the team gets to a sizable size, they would want to convert it to an in-house team. We highly supportive of that model also. So that way, clients, when they work with us, they have the cake and they can eat it too. The leverage the offshore model without the long-term and the short-term complexity with it. The next page, as it refreshes on your screen, is just a glimpse of some of our customers. Most of our clients are long-term clients, software companies, and we do ongoing product development work with a fair amount of focus lately in mobile development, big data, and cloud-based applications, just because that's the nature of what being developed these days. So that's a lot of what we do. With that introduction to citizenship out of the way, let's kind of talk about some of the questions. So, Mike, if you're ready, let's take a few questions.
Okay.
One question I postponed to the end here is, what are your thoughts on the role of architects in the context of using Agile for enhancements of large existing legacy applications? Can there be emergent architecture in that context of a legacy application?
Well, I definitely think that there can. Anytime you're morphing legacy systems or adding features to legacy systems, that's kind of the greenfield or sweet spot for Scrum and Agile. Yes, I think that's could possibly work. The thing I'm struggling with, though, is I guess there would be structural changes within the legacy system in support of a new architectural approach. And what you would do there is, once again, identify the features and the architectural features and your goals, and then break those down into user stories. And then you can run iterative development where the development, maybe it's less coding than it would be on a brand new system, but a lot of it is refactoring and rewriting existing legacy systems. So yes, I think it could definitely work.
Okay. Right. Let's take this other question, and I'm going to read it as to you. The Agile Manifesto says that the best architecture emerged from self-organizing teams. You concur with that, right? But how do you reconcile that with your and SAFE, this must be S-A-F-E, view of architect that doesn't work on a self-organizing Agile team? So do you recognize this viewpoint of SAFE? I think it's scale architecture framework. I think that's probably by one of the thinkers.
Oh,
I don't know if it's not Neil else, but someone else.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile the view, the architect that doesn't work on the self-organizing Agile team?
Well, how to reconcile it? If your architect is not part of a self-organizing team, they need to be. So, I don't know if that's a physical impossibility at this company, but I would say, look for ways to get that architect involved in the development as it goes through the different iterations.
Okay. All right. Let's take another question. The number of pages here that you talked about doing just enough architecture. So is there any guidance you have for the team? How do they know how much is just enough?
Right. When we have enough. I think if you asked every person on a Scrum team, the answer would be different. Some may lean towards no. Let's keep defining the architecture. Let's keep designing. Let's postpone jumping off into hardcore coding. Some would say only with a little bit of design thinking we should be able to jump into coding. And that's where the leaders of your team, the Scrum Master, and maybe the more experienced folks should jump in and say, okay, it starts to feel like we've got enough here that we can get started with. And ideally, it would be after just a few weeks or even less. If you, like we talked about Sprint Zero previously, if you put in that time and try as best you can to dedicate your very initial sprint to planning and architecture and design, then for most software systems and most projects, that should be sufficient.
So how do you handle the related question is some of the old school software practitioners would say, look, you've got to design
Right.
the foundation for the concrete and make sure that part right.
Yeah.
That's the basis. So there's an urge
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
architect up front,
Yeah.
so you can then pick up speed
Yeah.
and pace for long term. So how do you handle that?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. The answer has several facets, and I'll start with this. We, in a traditional world, we used to use this, build the house analogy, which was, okay, pour the slab, then put all of the studs up, and then the drywall, and then the tile and things like that, and that may have been a good analogy for traditional software development, but for Agile software development, that analogy just doesn't work. And I'd like to take that analogy and just spin it a little different way. Imagine a construction team, i.e. software developers, making a 2-week commitment to build out the dining room of the first floor. So what would they do? They would have some concrete, they would have some studs, and they would focus on that one room as opposed to, we need to establish the entire structural framework of the house. And then in doing the dining room, you're going to learn more about how to be more efficient. And, we didn't realize the soil was this type. And so as you go and do the next room, you carry those learnings forward. So if you're still using the build a house analogy, please stop, because it just doesn't make sense to use that analogy anymore in an Agile world. But back to your question, how do you convince old school guys? Well, I'm an old school guy. Probably 2/3 of my experience is in traditional, and 1/3 of my experience is in Agile. So here's what you have to do. You have to convince your old school guys of the benefits of Agile and iterative development. Is that something that they're just not comfortable with? They want to do it all, do all the architecture and design. You have to remind them that it truly is a new world, and they will be expected to adapt to survive. And so you have to, and then you have to ask them, would you at least be willing to try this? And really what you're telling them is, without circumventing or doing too much damage behind the scenes, would you at least be willing to try this? If they're not, and they're just dead set on their ways, then look for another position within the company to move them to and hire an Agilist.
All right. Let's take another question. This is the question is, we are a large company with many more Agile teams than architects. Mm-hmm. So how do you suggest we do in this case?
I'm not necessarily saying that each Scrum team needs an architect. Chances are, the architects might be able to serve maybe up to 2 Scrum teams, or even 3. It just depends on the level of architecture work that really needs to be done. And I would also add to that, look for opportunities to beef up your architect team, because now if they're especially involved in the coding, it's not like you're losing much productivity at all on the coding side. So maybe it's time to promote a handful or 10 or 20 of your most talented software engineers into architects and let them provide their value to multiple Scrum teams.
So you are supportive, let me just make sure we understand this, you're supportive of the idea of having a separate functional group called architect, but those people are assigned to each Scrum team perhaps.
Yes.
At time.
Yes, I think with most modern day companies, you have both a functional organization chart and a project, kind of a dynamic project organization chart. And the functional side, there may be an architecture group that all report to the CTO or a chief architect. However, from a project perspective, the project consists of a number of software developers, a number of QA, a number of PMs, and ideally one architect or at least a part-time architect. Right. So just like everybody else, the architects have to exist in both a functional role and a project role.
Okay. Let's take a slightly different question to add more. I think there's a question around, okay, what is the role and importance of automated testing when doing architecture refactoring on a core of a legacy code application?
Oh, yeah, wow. Well, automated testing, okay, I'm reading the question right now. Automated testing, yes. Chances are your legacy system is not instrumented to support automated testing. However, when you're going back to the legacy system and evolving the architecture in support of some grand accomplishment, if it is possible, you should instrument test case automation at that point. Now, it's, you know, you run into the situation where if the software system was not built with that in mind, it does become more difficult to instrument it. But you can instrument it as you go in support of the architectural user stories that are guiding your morphing work within the legacy system. So add stories or add tasks within each story that say, we must automate this user story and build it up as you go. And then before you know it, at the end of your architectural evolution effort, you will have a set of automated test cases that can exercise the aspects of that new architecture, but may not necessarily exercise the entire legacy system. Okay. That's how you should do it. Yeah.
Well, we're out of a lot of time window, so thank you very much, Mike, for joining us today. And this is an excellent topic. We'll have to probably come back to this in a few months again because there's so many questions and it's challenging for most Agile teams. So thank you all for attending today's webinar. Stay tuned for another good session next month on a different topic. Right? Thank you.